Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're diving straight into the sweltering streets of 1518 Strasbourg, and we're looking at what has to be one of history's most bizarre cold cases. We are talking about a terrifying epidemic where hundreds of people quite literally danced themselves to death. I know, it sounds like some kind of dark, twisted fairy tale, right? But this is 100% well-documented history.
So I want you to picture this. It's the middle of July in the Holy Roman Empire, year 1518, and the heat is just oppressive. A woman named Frau Kraffa steps out of her half-timbered house right onto a narrow cobblestone street. Now, there's no music playing, there's no local festival going on, but suddenly, out of nowhere, she violently and uncontrollably just begins to dance. And the crazy thing is, she doesn't stop. She keeps going for days on end. No food, no water, absolutely zero sleep. Her husband is begging her to stop, but she's completely unreachable. Think about it. Have you ever felt totally wiped out after just like an hour of dancing? Imagine keeping that up for days.
And, this wasn't just some quirky, isolated incident with one person. The way this contagion spread is honestly mind-boggling. Within just 6 days of Frau Kraffa taking those first frantic steps, 34 other townsfolk caught whatever this was, and they joined in. Eyewitnesses describe their faces as completely blank and vacant, with these jerky, almost combative movements. Then, jump to early August, and that number swells to over 400 desperate people. In less than a month, a single, solitary dancer had turned the city square into this surreal, terrifying spectacle of constant, involuntary movement. And we need to be clear here. The stakes were literally life and death. The historical chronicles report that at the absolute peak of this outbreak, up to 15 people a day, yeah, you heard that right, up to 15 people every single day were just collapsing in the public squares. And they weren't just passing out to take a nap. They were actually succumbing to sheer physical exhaustion, massive strokes, or heart attacks right there on the cobblestones. Our bodies are simply not built to handle continuous, intense physical exertion for days and weeks on end. The city was in a profound, massive crisis, and the authorities, well, they had absolutely no clue what to do.
Now, the tragic irony of all this is how the medical establishment actually responded. Strasbourg wasn't some backwater. It was a sophisticated city with a respected medical college. So the physicians come in, observe the afflicted, and they rely on the humoral theories of the time. The prevailing belief that your health was all about balancing bodily fluids? Well, they confidently diagnosed these poor people with hot blood. Basically, they thought a physiological imbalance was overheating the brain, causing all this feverish, twitching behavior. So, what was their grand medical prescription? Get this, to let the energy burn itself out. Yep, the official, supposedly scientifically backed cure in 1518 was to literally force these victims to dance even more.
And to make this cure happen, the city council rolled out a series of interventions that just backfired catastrophically. They actually cleared out the guild halls. They built these massive wooden stages right in the center of the horse market. They even went out and hired professional musicians. We're talking pipers, drummers, fiddlers, just to keep the rhythm going. Oh, and they paid strongmen to physically hold up the exhausted dancers when their bodies started giving out. It is wild. But of course, creating this massive public spectacle accidentally supercharged the contagion. Having these thrashing, bleeding victims up on elevated stages meant sheer terror just rippled through the watching crowds. They essentially turned their medical intervention into a deadly magnet for new victims.
So, realizing they had made a colossal mistake and their medical intervention was a total disaster, the authorities did a complete 180 on their diagnosis. They recognized this as choreomania, or dancing mania. See, Strasbourg happened to sit in what was called the Saint Vitus corridor, which was a region with a really long history of these weird outbreaks. And the local folks there, they deeply, genuinely believed this was a supernatural curse. They were absolutely convinced that Saint Vitus, who ironically is the patron saint of dancers, had been angered by their sins and he was punishing the whole city by forcing them into this horrific, never-ending physical torment.
Getting truly desperate, the council completely abandoned medicine and turned straight to religion. They brought in this ancient 4-step ritual to try and cure the afflicted. Step 1, they actually bound the thrashing dancers and loaded them up into wagons. Step 2, they hauled them 30 miles over these incredibly rough whirl roads all the way to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Saverne. Step 3 is where it gets really specific. They took tiny red shoes, blessed them with holy water and crosses of consecrated oil, and put them on the dancers' bloodied feet. And finally, priests chanting in Latin led the victims in this heavily choreographed circular walking ritual. And incredibly, it worked. By taking all that chaotic, violent energy and channeling it into a controlled, holy procession, the epidemic miraculously came to a halt. Okay, but seriously, what actually caused this whole thing? Over the centuries, we've seen quite a few suspects pop up. First, you've got the 16th-century clergy, who, as we mentioned, blamed a spiritual curse from Saint Vitus brought on by the town's moral decay. Then, a bit later, you have the famous alchemist Paracelsus. He investigated the whole ordeal and pushed this wildly misogynistic theory, blaming laughing veins and the supposedly rebellious imaginations and desires of women. Yikes. Fast forward to the 20th century, and historians started pointing the finger at ergot poisoning, which is essentially like an accidental LSD trip caused by eating moldy rye bread. And finally, that brings us to modern historians, like John Waller, who argue for something called mass psychogenic illness.
Now, for a really long time, the moldy bread theory, ergot poisoning, was the go-to explanation. But honestly, we can completely debunk that one today. Ergotism, which was historically known as St. Anthony's fire, is awful. It causes severe muscle cramps, debilitating pain, literal gangrene, and a complete loss of motor control. I mean, victims of severe ergot poisoning can barely walk, let alone dance. But look at the Strasbourg victims. They were doing coordinated, rhythmic movements. They were sustaining intense physical exertion for days on end, even mimicking specific cultural dance steps. The crippling, horrific reality of eating toxic mold just does not match up with the incredible physical endurance we saw during the dancing plague. So, to finally crack this historical cold case, we really have to lean into historian John Waller's conclusion. The dancing plague of 1518 was, without a doubt, a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness. What is that? Well, it happens when a really tightly knit group of people is subjected to just extreme psychological stress and trauma. It gets so bad that their minds actually force their bodies to physically act out their deepest, culturally shared fears. There's no poison involved, there's no underlying organic disease, it's just that the mind completely breaks under the pressure and the body has no choice but to follow suit. And the citizens of Strasbourg? They were uniquely, tragically primed for this exact kind of psychological break. They were staring down a catastrophic convergence of trauma. The year before this happened had been utterly devastating. We're talking freezing winters that totally wiped out the crops, which led to rocketing grain prices and rampant starvation. I mean, people were literally mixing sawdust into their bread just to feel full. On top of that, you had this terrifying new epidemic, syphilis, which was rotting people from the inside out, and nobody knew how to cure it. Throw in the extreme societal breakdown from the impending Protestant Reformation and some brutal peasant uprisings, and you've got a population pushed way, way beyond the limits of human endurance. Historian John Waller sums it up so perfectly. He says, "The minds of the choreomaniacs were drawn inwards, tossed about on the violent seas of their deepest fears." And that right there is absolutely crucial to understand. These people were not faking it. This wasn't some kind of political protest, and it definitely wasn't a giant street party. Their absolute terrifying belief in the curse of Saint Vitus, all mixed together with their starvation and total despair, meant that their traumatized minds physically manifested the exact divine punishment they expected to receive. The fear of the curse literally created the curse. Which brings us right back to the ultimate irony of this entire medical mystery. Remember that bizarre ritual at the shrine of Saint Vitus? The one with the Latin chanting and those tiny red shoes? Well, it worked. But it didn't work because of magic, holy water, or some divine intervention. It worked because a psychological illness demands a psychological cure. The whole ritual was successful because the dancers deeply, implicitly believed, down to their core, that it would cure them. The symbolic weight of that ceremony provided the exact psychological release their minds needed to finally just let go and relinquish control of their exhausted bodies. So while we might not be out there dancing ourselves to death in the public squares today, the whole story of Strasbourg leaves us with a really fascinating and honestly a little bit unsettling question to ponder. As you think about everything we've unpacked in this explainer today, ask yourself, is the modern mind truly immune? Or, when we face our own times of intense social upheaval, skyrocketing stress, and viral panic, are our minds still just as susceptible to the invisible contagions of collective anxiety and shared trauma? It's something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history around you.